Predicting when a marriage will take a turn for the worse is challenging, especially when it's been grounded in trust for decades. Suddenly, my wife confessed that she fell in love with someone at first sight after 25 years of marriage. I was shocked and devastated, but her next words left me reeling. Remember that scene in The Godfather where Michael Corleone sees a stunning woman in Italy and becomes completely captivated? His Sicilian bodyguards notice and discuss how he's been hit by the thunderbolt and fallen in love. That's not just a Hollywood fabrication. I actually witnessed it firsthand, though I didn't realize it at the time. It happened to my wife. Sadly, it wasn't with me when we first met, but with another man 25 years into our marriage, marking the beginning of the end of what I thought was a perfect life. But I'm jumping ahead. It's a tendency when reflecting on my past life and how things were supposed to unfold. I suppose I should start at the beginning and introduce myself. I'm Gerald Bennett, but everyone just calls me Jerry. I'm 50 years old and I reside in a small Midwestern city about 2 hours away from Chicago. I work as an accountant for a sizable national firm. It's not the most exciting job, but the pay is good, and except for the busy months of March and April, the hours are typically a solid 40 per week, with no weekends. I was married until 2 years ago. My ex-wife and I have a daughter named Deborah, who's 25 years old, married, has a child of her own, and lives in Denver. My marriage ended in divorce after 26 years, the first 25 of which I thought were fantastic, as I mentioned earlier. I met Diana at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, during my sophomore year. She was also a sophomore, having transferred into my dorm after her freshman year in another building. I first saw her outside the dorm, lying on a towel, basking in Iowa's August sunshine with her athletic figure. "Guys, I need to go. I'm about to introduce myself to the future Mrs. Bennett," I joked, not entirely serious. My two friends followed my gaze to Diana. "Wow," one of them said. I heard the words, but I couldn't tell you which one of them spoke. I was completely captivated by this blonde goddess lying on a towel in a bikini beside the dorm. Ignoring my friends, I walked over to introduce myself, but when I got about 4 feet from her, she propped herself up on one elbow and waved me off with her other hand. I felt crushed until she spoke up. "Hey, dumbass, you're my son." I immediately shuffled to my right, allowing the sunlight to return to my goddess. She greeted me with a brilliant smile, and in that moment, I would have done anything for her. "Much better, dumbass," she giggled. She didn't seem bothered by a stranger approaching her. I suppose when you look like her, it probably happens all the time. I introduced myself, told her she was beautiful, and asked her out for a date on the following Friday. "If I say yes, will you wipe the drool off your chin?" she asked coyly. "What?" "Yes, drool, drool, drool. Of course. It disappeared right away," I replied. "Well, I can definitely see you're not one of those smooth talkers with a line for everything, so sure, we can go out on Friday night." I got her phone number. That Friday night, we dined at a cozy Italian restaurant in Ames. As I sat there, completely enamored, she effortlessly recounted her life story from age 3 to the present. I think she only paused because our main course had arrived. We just clicked. Within a month, we spent almost all our free time together. She wasn't just intelligent, she was her high school's valedictorian, but she had a mischievous sense of humor and a quiet confidence. I considered myself decent looking, nothing extraordinary, but I was fairly athletic, earned 7 varsity letters in high school, intelligent, ranked in the top 5 of my high school, and could hold my own in conversations on a wide range of topics. Though, as Diana pointed out, I wasn't the smooth-talking type, I had confidence in myself. Still, I knew I was punching above my weight when I asked her out. But hey, you never know if you don't try, right? Diana and I tied the knot soon after graduation. We both found jobs easily, she as a 3rd-grade teacher and me as an accountant. With solid incomes, we bought a house a couple of years later, and almost exactly a year after moving in, we welcomed our daughter into the world. Life was good. Our intimate life, while not overly adventurous, was fulfilling and frequent enough for both of us, though like many couples, time and age did impact its frequency. Still, even after Deborah left for college, we were still active 3 or 4 times a week. Through the years, I had moments where I worried about Diana being faithful, but they were rare. Occasionally, she'd mention one of the new young teachers at her school being a bit flirty, but she never gave me any reason to believe she reciprocated or that anything progressed further. So, I always chalked it up to my own paranoia. I mean, I'm not blind. My wife is still attractive, and I couldn't fault any man for giving her a second glance, just a glance. Sharing isn't part of my vocabulary. I made that clear to Diana when we first became exclusive. She echoed the sentiment, saying she felt the same way. She didn't mind if I looked at other women, but any form of touching would be unacceptable. I was more than fine with that. And that was how things were until 3 years ago. We were at the annual summer party hosted by our neighbors 3 doors down in our trendy neighborhood. James and Viola Sanders threw a fantastic all-day bash at their place every year, the weekend after the 4th of July. Diana and I never missed it, and neither did most of our neighbors. James and Viola were superb hosts. The food and drinks were top-notch. They had a large in-ground pool and a sand volleyball court. Even the guests they invited from outside the neighborhood were good people, except for one, but I'll get to that. The party kicked off at noon, and Diana and I strolled in around 1. I headed to the bar, grabbed a white Zinfandel for Diana and a Michelob for myself, and we began mingling, first together, then separately as we got caught up in various conversations both inside and outside the house. It had never been an issue before. Every now and then, I'd check in with Diana to see if she needed a refill or some snacks, and sometimes she'd find me. We usually exchanged a quick peck on the lips before parting ways. I was chatting with a group of male neighbors while Diana was across the yard, engaged in conversation with a group of women, when a small group of outsiders arrived. It was a man with 2 women, and James went up to greet them. That's when I saw the thunderbolt hit Diana. As I glanced at the newcomers, I happened to look over at Diana, who had stopped talking to her friends and was staring at the newcomers with a look on her face that I can now describe as a mix of amazement and pure desire. At the time, I didn't fully comprehend the look, only that she seemed mesmerized, and I have to admit my spider senses started tingling. She watched them for about 10 seconds before turning in my direction, meeting my eyes, and blushing a deep red. Then she turned back to her friends and rejoined the conversation. Have you ever had one of those moments where you just feel like something isn't quite right, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's the feeling I got about an hour later, and it didn't help when I scanned the yard and couldn't find Diana. I grabbed a white wine for her from the bar and started to wander around. Finally, I found her in the Sanders den with 4 other people, including the guy she had been staring at earlier. In fact, he had his arm casually draped around my wife's back, his hand resting on her right hip. It seemed a bit too cozy for my liking, especially considering she had just met this guy, and the 5 of them appeared to be engaged in friendly conversation. I trust myself and completely trust my wife, and I didn't want to make a scene, but I felt this was crossing a line for the newcomer. I approached the group from behind Diana and her new friend, and I firmly gripped his wrist to remove it from her hip. I don't think we've met yet, despite the fact that you seem a bit too comfortable with my wife, I said, my voice carrying a hard edge. He tried to pull away, but my grip on his wrist kept him in place. Diana, who had seemed flushed before I approached, turned even redder when she realized I was right there. "Oh, Jerry, please." She sort of squealed as she realized I was squeezing his wrist. "Jerry, this is Andrew Balzac. He teaches European literature at the college. He's French, and he wasn't doing anything inappropriate, so I just let his hand stay where it was." The others in the group nodded in agreement, so I released Andrew's wrist and shook his hand firmly, applying a bit too much pressure and unintentionally squeezing a few of his middle hand bones together. Diana then introduced me to the rest of the group, almost as an afterthought. "Thought you might need a refill," I said to her as I handed her the wine glass, keeping my eyes fixed on Andrew. "You're so considerate, my dear husband," she replied. Andrew struck me as typical Eurotrash. I couldn't help but notice he was a pretty good-looking guy of 32, slightly above average height, with a 3-day beard and hair that was somewhere between long and needing a trim. He spoke with a full French accent in English, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was probably involved with half of his students, both the female and male ones. After the introductions, he resumed discussing Victor Hugo or someone else, and feeling satisfied that I had asserted myself, I wandered back outside to the yard. Diana and Andra made their way to the backyard for the start of the sand volleyball game. I was always heavily involved in these matches, and as we played on the winner's court, my team was frequently on the court. We always attracted a decent crowd watching from the safety of the deck, where my wife settled, with Andra right next to her. I was too focused on the game to pay much attention to them, but I did notice plenty of hand and arm touching, smiling, and the occasional blush from my wife. Every so often, I'd wave over to her, and she'd wave back. My team had been winning games for a while, and after an hour, I noticed that Diana and Andre were no longer in their seats. I scanned the bar and the grill area but didn't see them. My intuition was screaming, so I convinced one of the other guys to take my place, jokingly blaming my tired 47-year-old legs and claiming I needed a beer urgently. I endured some good-natured teasing about being an old man as I left the sand court. To keep up appearances, I headed to the bar and grabbed another beer, then wandered around the yard aimlessly before deciding to check inside the house. I went through every open room and listened intently at the closed doors, but there was no sign of Diana or Andra. Finally, I approached the hostess, Viola, and casually asked if she had seen my wife recently. "Yeah, she and Andra went out to his car to check something, I think," Viola replied casually. "What kind of car does he drive?" I asked, my tone a bit tense. Viola's expression suddenly shifted. We'd been friends and neighbors for over 15 years, and concern crossed her face as she answered, a gray sob. I stepped outside and looked down the street, but there was no sign of Saab. Viola joined me in the driveway. "I'm sure it's nothing, Jerry," she said soothingly. "They probably just went to the college for a moment." "Yeah, thanks. Probably nothing," I muttered, lacking conviction, and walked off. The local college was only 5 minutes away. I decided to check it out myself. I drove over and searched through every parking lot they had. No Saab. I dialed Diana's cell, but it went straight to voicemail, indicating she was either busy or her phone was off. I left a message. Over the next hour, I left 4 more messages as I sat in my house. I also called her parents and her sister, asking if they had heard from her today. They all said no. The old Sherlock Holmes quote came to mind. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. I settled into my lazy-boy in the family room and stared at the blank big screen for hours. I didn't need to turn on the TV to see images because in my mind's eye, I saw my wife cheating on me with that French bastard. Why did we bother saving this country in 2 world wars? Should have let the Germans keep it. I didn't sleep a wink all night as I sat in the chair, staring at the TV. I half expected Diana to sneak into the house in the middle of the night, but when that didn't happen, I began to worry that Andra might have been in a car wreck with Diana. At about 8 a.m., I called the local sheriff's office, identified myself, and asked if there had been any wrecks during the night. They said there weren't. I called Diana's phone another 4 times and got nothing each time. As noon approached, I heard a car pull into the driveway, and I could tell it was just one person from the sound of a single door slamming. About 45 seconds later, Diana unlocked the door, stepped inside, and quietly made her way to the sofa on the opposite side of the family room where I was sitting. Any lingering doubts about what they were up to were quickly dispelled by her appearance. At least she had the decency to shower before coming home. Her long blonde hair, which had been loose yesterday, was now pulled back into a damp ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She was still in the yellow sundress from yesterday, and her chest, shoulders, and arms were tinged pink from the sun. Despite the situation, I had to admit she looked good. But what struck me more was her lack of remorse or guilt. Instead, she seemed to wear a condescending smirk. "Nice of you to show up. Did you have a good time last night and this morning?" I sneered. "Actually, I did," she replied smugly. That wasn't the response I was expecting. "Look, Jerry," she continued calmly, Have you ever in your life felt an incredible physical and emotional connection with someone from the moment you saw them? I mean, completely amazing, almost electric, and wonderful and amazing. Yes, I have, I answered immediately. I married that woman. That wasn't the response she expected. Her usually calm demeanor shattered, her eyes revealing a hint of recognition of my despair. I met someone yesterday. I can't explain it. I have to be with him. I love him, she said. Just like that? Are you out of your mind? I shouted. You're willing to throw away 25 years of marriage because of a feeling. Did I mean nothing to you? I'm not sure why she was surprised by my outburst. She started sobbing uncontrollably. I didn't care. I do love you, Jerry, she finally choked out. What we've shared has been wonderful, but this connection with him is unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love you, but I'm in love with him. It's incredible. Incredible, I understand. Give me some time to digest this, and maybe I'll throw you a party, I said sarcastically. So, should we start filing for divorce, or do you want to? I asked. Either way, it'll be an equal split, and we'll sell the house and divide the money. I don't think we need to rush into divorce just yet, she said with a hint of exasperation. Let's see how things unfold. We can make big decisions later. Now it was my turn to feel exasperated. What? I protested. That's not going to fly. You can't just keep me on standby. If you're involved with him, you can have him as soon as possible. As far as I'm concerned, we were finished as of yesterday when you first did it. The fact that you've repeated it with him several times since then only strengthens my resolve. But, she stammered. Fine then, I'll file for divorce, and I'll be out by the end of the week. True to my word, by the end of the week, I had my belongings out of the house. I took a couple of personal days off from work and got it done. While I was loading up my pickup one evening, James and Viola Sanders came down the block and apologized to me for inviting Andrew to their party. I stopped them politely, pointing out that they couldn't have known Diana would act like this with him. Still, we can't help but feel responsible, Viola said, looking at their shoes. My lawyer had divorce papers drawn up, and Diana was served within a month. Apparently, she thought I would drag my feet, because my lawyer told me the process server said she had a fit when he handed her the papers, which explains why 2 days later she showed up at my new apartment and barged right in when I answered the door to her ringing the bell. How could you do this if you love me as much as you say you do? She railed as she walked into my apartment. I was shocked at first, but quickly recovered as anger took over. Are you serious? I yelled back. You're with another man. What did you expect me to do? I may love you, but I'm not going to be your willing cuckold. If this doesn't work out, what am I supposed to do then? Just give me a little time. If it doesn't work out, I'll come back to you and be the best wife ever. We can grow old together, she pleaded. You're delusional, I retorted. I'm not letting you run off with the man of your dreams until you're sure it's right. Besides, if he's your dream guy, why wouldn't it work out? Andrew is in the process of divorcing his wife, and they have some financial issues to sort out. So, in other words, he may be Mr. Right for you, but you might not be his Mrs. Right, I interjected. More sputtering followed before I finally demanded she get her cheating self out of my apartment, or I would throw her out myself. Diana and her attorney did everything they could to slow down the divorce process. Meanwhile, Mr. Wonderful moved into my old house and took my place. 4 months later, I was leaving Shays Michaels with a colleague after a business dinner when I saw a familiar face, actually 2 faces, heading towards the door. It was Andrew and a visibly pregnant Diana. She appeared to be about 3 months along. I stopped in my tracks, gawking, blocking their entrance into the restaurant. Oh my God, I muttered half under my breath. My colleague had stopped alongside me, looking thoroughly confused as the 4 of us stood face to face. Martin, I'd like you to meet my wife, at least for a few more months, and her lover, Andrew Balzac, I introduced them awkwardly. Martin found himself in the unenviable position of having to maintain politeness in an extremely uncomfortable situation. I thought he handled himself well. She's pregnant. Is that yours? He asked after a few seconds of silence. That is most definitely his, I replied brightly. You're an asshole, Jerry. You know that, was all she said as she and Andre stepped past us and into the restaurant. I later found out from Viola Sanders that Diana was indeed 3 months along. Apparently, Andrew was such a wonderful man that Diana wanted to have his child and went off birth control. Good luck with that, was all I said to Viola. The divorce was finalized several months later, and 2 months after that, Diana brought a son into the world. Of course, they named him Andrew Jr., because when you're so wonderful, what better way to tell the world than by naming another human being after yourself? Our daughter Deborah wasn't exactly thrilled about Diana's decision to have another child at this point in life, especially since her parents weren't together and I wasn't the father. I'll admit I was proud of my daughter for taking my side in this mess. While I knew she had the baby, I hadn't talked to Diana or seen her since running into her at the restaurant all those months ago. I suppose I knew it would happen eventually, since we both lived in town, but I have to admit I was more than a little surprised the first time I saw Diana after she had given birth. The extra weight gain didn't look good on her, and it seemed like the whole experience had been tough on her now 49-year-old body. I almost walked right past the somewhat grandmotherly woman pushing the stroller with what looked to be a 1-year-old boy in it in the mall in town. Jerry, come on, there's no need to be so rude, a familiar voice chastised me as I hurried past the pair one Saturday afternoon. I stopped abruptly, recognizing the voice, and despite my efforts not to, I did a slow double take at the woman and the baby. Oh no, it was Diana and her son. Hey, stranger, I greeted, trying to collect myself. Hey yourself, she replied. The baby was undeniably beautiful, inheriting Diana's hair and eye color, but with a slightly darker complexion like his father's. Wow, Mom, he's beautiful, I remarked sincerely. Diana blushed lightly and thanked me. I haven't seen you in a while, and well, pushing a stroller, I apologized for not recognizing her immediately. Although she visibly flinched at my apology, she let it pass without comment. Despite finding her incredibly attractive after Deborah's birth many years ago, she was over 20 years older now, and with this baby not being mine, I suppose my hormones were in check. We chatted amicably for a few more minutes, mostly about her struggles with sleep, and I detected a note of genuine sadness, something she never displayed after Deborah's birth. I finally excused myself and continued shopping for what I had come for. The next time I saw Diana was at the Sanders' summer party about 6 months later. James and Viola had always felt guilty that it was at their party where Diana met Andrew, but I assured them then, as I do now, that I didn't blame them for Diana's poor decision. Nevertheless, Viola kept trying to set me up with her single and divorced friends, and I must admit, some of those setups were pretty good. They kept inviting me back to the annual summer party, and after missing the last two, I decided to attend again, even though they warned me that Diana and Andrew would be there. I assured them that if any issues arose, I wouldn't be the cause, and I meant it. I had been at the party for a couple of hours when I spotted Diana and Andrew entering the backyard. Since their baby wasn't with them, I assumed they had left the child with a sitter. Diana had shed some of her pregnancy weight and didn't appear as matronly as she did the last time I saw her, but there was an unmistakable sadness in her once bright blue eyes. Even when she smiled, there was a certain emptiness in her gaze. I decided to address the elephant in the room early, so I approached Diana and Andrew, giving Diana a gentle hug and shaking Andrew's hand. I could tell they were both a bit surprised, and I noticed Viola holding her breath as I approached them. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, I excused myself and rejoined my friends by the grill. When the sand volleyball game started, I joined one of the teams. My team played the second game, and while I was on the sand, I noticed Diana sitting in a chair, watching and cheering. Mr. Wonderful was nowhere to be seen. We played 2 games, losing the second, so we had to leave the court and wait for our next turn. As I went to get a beer, I glanced over at Diana, sitting alone. Old habits die hard, I thought, grabbing my drink and heading inside. I checked the third room, the den, and my suspicions were confirmed. Andrew had his arm around Marian Adams's waist, chatting in a small group, while Marion looked at him with unmistakable desire. Marion, a former neighbor from down the street, was definitely married. I should have kept to myself, I mused. If I keep quiet, Andrew might end up cheating on Diana. But if I speak up, I'll face trouble either way. A true friend would intervene, but I was merely her ex-husband. Why was it my responsibility? Then fate intervened. Marion's husband, Travis, was on my sand volleyball team and apparently had followed me inside. He saw the same scene. Andrew with his arm around his wife, and Marion gazing at him like he was irresistible. "You son of a bitch, get your hands off my wife, you bastard." Travis screamed at Andrew as he lunged toward the pair. I started to move to intervene, but then common sense prevailed, and I let my volleyball teammate rush past me. Before Andrew could pull away, Travis grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply. There was a distinct crack, followed by Andrew's howl of pain. The room quickly filled with more people as they came to see what the commotion was about. Luckily, one of Viola's friends was an emergency room nurse. She took one look at Andrew's arm and called for an ambulance. They arrived about 10 minutes later with 2 police officers. The officers took statements from everyone present in case Andrew decided to press charges against Travis Adams. The senior officer, St. Will Ross, appeared to be around my age. The junior officer, Officer Grace McBride, looked about 40, with freckles, green eyes, and long orange hair. I made sure to go over to Officer McBride's side of the room to give my statement. In the midst of this chaos was Diana, crying and holding onto Andrew's good arm, trying to comfort him while the EMTs worked. She clearly had no idea what had happened. When the EMTs stabilized Andrew, they put him in the ambulance, but told Diana she would have to make her own way to the hospital. She looked at me with a lost expression, so I nodded and pointed to Officer McBride, then held up 5 fingers. McBride saw Diana waiting for me, so she questioned me next. I gave her my perspective on what had happened, including the fact that Andrew had stolen my wife at a party 3 years ago. She looked surprised at my revelation. "And you're still going to take her to the hospital to be with him?" she asked. "Are you just that nice of a guy or a complete idiot?" I have to admit, I didn't see that one coming. Looking up at her, I saw she was trying to stifle a smile. "Complete idiot," I replied. She seemed caught off guard by my response and let out a small chuckle. I found myself enjoying the sound. After a couple more questions, I finished giving my statement. She told me I could take Diana to the hospital, but before I left, she warned me that Diana probably wouldn't believe my story. "Don't expect her to," I replied. As I started to turn away, she began moving to the next person for a statement, but a quick thought crossed my mind, and I blurted it out. "Maybe you should give me your card in case I remember something else, officer." She grinned back at me, her eyes practically sparkling. Taking a card from the top left pocket of her uniform shirt, she flipped it over and wrote what I assumed was her personal phone number. "Thank you, officer," I chuckled back at her, then put on my serious face and turned toward Diana. "Let's go." On the way to the hospital, Diana asked me what had happened to Andrew. I told her the truth, but I wasn't surprised when she didn't believe me. "Can't you just move on, Jerry?" she whined. "It's been 3 years." "It's not about moving on, Trace," I replied. Andrew shouldn't have laid his hands on Marion Adams, and Travis did the right thing. Maybe if I had been as bold, you and I would still be together. I hadn't expected those words to come out. Tears welled in Diana's eyes as she turned away from me in the pickup. I dropped Diana off at the emergency room and didn't go in with her. She'd have to get an Uber back to the small home she and Andrew shared since we sold our house and split the proceeds after the divorce. With her gone for the night, I reached into my shirt pocket for the card Officer Grace McBride had given me earlier. A lovely woman, I thought to myself. I tried to play it cool, so I waited 3 days before calling Officer Grace McBride. She answered on the second ring. "Could you have waited any longer?" "I could have gotten engaged and married by now," she teased over the phone. "I suppose you're right, but if you move that fast, then you're never going to be the next and final Mrs. Gerald Bennett," I replied. "Now who's being cheeky?" she countered. How do you know I'll even say yes when you ask me out? And no, I don't want to go to any freaking Irish pub on a date. Her Irish pub comment caught me off guard because honestly, that's what I had in mind. It just seemed like the thing to do, taking an Irish girl to an Irish pub. She picked up on my hesitation and knew she had guessed right. What the hell is with you guys? Don't any of you have any creativity? You see flaming red hair and right away you all think Irish pub. I stuttered for a split second before I came up with my plan B. We had a top-notch Greek restaurant in the city that I absolutely loved, and Greek food is quite a step away from Irish. She thought for about a nanosecond before responding positively. Thanks for being a little creative on the rebound, she said. Once I turned down the Irish pub, most guys immediately go to Asian. I'm sorry, but I'm not a big fan of food that looks like it could be a haven for cockroaches. I guffawed out loud at that one, and I think that's when I knew I might have found someone to grow old with. We talked for another hour about everything and nothing. I found out she was actually 45 and had been divorced for 10 years. Seems her ex also had a problem with fidelity. She had a son who was a Michigan State sophomore, majoring in pre-law. Saturday night's dinner was exquisite, and the company was simply delightful. I arrived at her house on the south side of town and was truly mesmerized by how stunning she looked in her little black dress and towering 4-inch heels. She had curves in all the right places, gorgeous legs, a lovely face, and that striking red hair. She was the epitome of beauty. Our conversation meandered through various topics, captivating me completely. Her voice was like music to my ears, and I could have listened to her all night long. Neither of us seemed to be in a rush to settle down, which made her both relaxed and intriguing. She possessed a natural curiosity, almost like that of a detective, asking probing questions and carefully considering my responses. After dinner, I drove her back home. I didn't extend an invitation to my place, and she didn't invite me in either when we reached her doorstep. We exchanged good nights, and then she surprised me by leaning in for a soft kiss on the cheek. I felt my face flush with embarrassment as I bid her good night and floated back to my car. It was like being 16 all over again. Her lips were soft against my cheek, and I caught a hint of White Shoulder's perfume lingering in the air. She called me Sunday morning, inviting me over for bagels and lox at her place. How could I resist such an offer? A few days later, Viola and James asked me to dinner, partly to apologize for recent events and partly to hear my side of the story. Apparently, Andrew was threatening legal action against them and Travis Adams. This guy must think he's God's gift to women, James exclaimed at one point. He is rather handsome and charming, I must admit, Viola said, earning a glare from James. According to the Sanderses, Travis spent the weekend in jail before being bailed out on Monday morning. When he returned home, Marion and their kids were gone, staying with her mother in another town. James speculated that their 12-year marriage was likely over. Well, give Travis my number and let him know that I understand what he's going through. I'll be there for him if he needs someone to talk to. And I'll back him up when this ends up in court, I offered. We'll pass on the message, and I'm sure he'll appreciate it, James replied. By the way, this was the last summer fling we're hosting. I can't handle this kind of pressure. Viola seemed preoccupied with her plate as James spoke. It seemed that things weren't going so well in Sandersland since the party. A few months later, when 47-year-old Viola began to visibly show a baby bump in public, my suspicions were confirmed. I didn't need to guess who the father might be, because James himself called me to break the news. Can you believe this? He practically screamed into the phone when I answered. That jerk got my wife pregnant. She's been seeing him since last year's party. According to James, he hadn't suspected a thing until Viola started getting morning sickness. It was the same pattern she had when she was pregnant with their 2 children years ago. When James confronted her, she admitted to having an affair with Andrew for over a year, although most of the time they used protection. However, during a weekend getaway at a motel, they ran out and decided to take the risk without it. After learning all this, James asked for the name of my attorney. Can I at least get a friends and family discount? He joked bitterly. Andrew and Viola had apparently moved into an apartment near the campus. leaving Diana and her son to fend for themselves, James informed me. Not my problem, I replied. But then I underestimated the complexity of the female mind. I was having lunch at a nearby McDonald's when she approached my table, holding her son's hand. She placed her tray of food on the table across from me, and the child eagerly sat beside me. "Hey, Diana." "Hi, Andrew Jr." I greeted them as I approached. The child, now around 3 years old, extended a clean hand for a handshake. Impressed by his attempt at maturity, I took his little hand in mine and shook it firmly. "Hello, sir," he said in his most grown-up voice. "Hello, Jerry," Diana added. "He's really growing," I remarked, looking at her son. "You might have a 6-footer on your hands someday." Diana seemed to appreciate my attempt at civility, but her troubled expression hinted at something deeper. "Ask me already," I encouraged her gently, observing her son unwrap a cheeseburger. "Did you ever really love me as much as you said you did?" she began softly. "Because if you did, then how come you didn't fight for me, like Travis did for Marion? How come you never asked me to come back, like someone who truly loved me would have? How come you haven't stopped by my house to see how me and my son are doing and maybe invite us over for an evening?" I hadn't seen that coming at all. Suddenly, was this my fault? I took in a deep breath, trying to remain calm and avoid an angry outburst. "So this whole thing is on me? Seriously, you're the wronged innocent party here." My voice started to rise as I spoke. This wasn't what I wanted. I needed to make my point without escalating. "Do you remember when I removed Andrew's hand from your waist and you insisted there was nothing going on, urging me not to cause trouble? I trusted you completely, so I didn't push further. I trusted your word. Forgive me for that. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have trusted you. I would have confronted him, like Travis did. But you, the person I trusted the most, lied to me, so I didn't fight for you. When you came home the next day at noon, what could I say? The deed had already been done, many times by the looks of you. So what was left to fight about at that point? You had given yourself to another man and broken our vows. There wasn't anything left for me to fight for. You made it abundantly clear. This was your decision alone, and I had no say in it. So what was left? You were no longer mine. You were his. But you never even tried to change my mind," she whined, "or make me stay. Nothing. If you really loved me. How many times did you sleep with Andrew that first night?" "And morning? I'll bet it was several," I said. "Once was a terrible mistake, but maybe I could have taken you back. Twice was already a conscious choice. More than that was you breaking my heart and stomping it to pieces. And you had the audacity to tell me you had a fantastic time, an incredible time, if memory serves me right, and that you and he had this almost otherworldly connection. You didn't regret a thing. You know, lust and slut are made of the same 4 letters, so what was I supposed to do? As the saying goes, if you love something, let it go. If it comes back, it's yours. If not, it never was. And then, just to add insult to injury, you have his kid at 48. I couldn't get you to agree to a second child in 25 years, but not only do you easily give yourself to Mr. Wonderful, but then you let him impregnate you. So this is about your bruised male ego," she said, perhaps a bit too snappily for my taste. My head shot up at that, but with our child sitting at the table with us, I didn't take the bait. "No, what you did once you were his was your choice. You apparently loved him enough to want to have his baby, even if you never wanted another with me. Trust me, I got the message." We ate in silence for a few minutes. She looked hesitant. I knew where this was going, but someone had to address it. "So now, what's your plan?" I finally asked. "You and Andrew never married, but he is listed as the child's father, right? At the very least, you should go after him for child support." "I'm going to let Viola have him," Diana said. "But you're right, I should get child support from that cheating jerk. That's good advice. Do you ever think about us, sometimes?" she added. "How it would have been?" "Honestly, no," I responded quietly. "You broke my heart so completely that I never wanted to ponder what might have been. I have some wonderful memories of our past life that I will cherish forever. But that's in the past, and it's not coming back." We resumed eating. I watched the boy play with his French fries, recalling a time when our daughter Deborah did the same thing. He's a good kid. I'm glad something positive came out of that relationship. Even though we started with a strong connection, ultimately we never really bonded the way you and I did. It began with passion, I won't deny, but it never evolved into a true partnership. Love never replaced lust once the spark faded. And that's when it seemed to dawn on her, that moment of realization. She shook her head sadly, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. She traded the warmth and security of love for the lightning strike of lust, and like true lightning, it had its moment of brilliance before vanishing. Epilogue. My wife and I just celebrated our 10th wedding anniversary with a trip to Spain. At first, I suggested to her a celebratory trip to her homeland, but she resisted, and in the end, we decided to go to a sunny and positive country. We have a few more years of work to do before we retire from the computer security firm we started together a few years ago. We've done quite well since I retired from engineering and she retired from the police force to start the company. We are together almost constantly, both professionally and personally, and yet it never gets boring. I know it sounds corny, but I think I love her more every day. Between us, we now have 5 grandchildren from our 2 kids. Despite one family living in Denver, CO, and the other in Houston, TX, we manage to see the grandkids regularly. I occasionally bump into Diana around town, but our conversations are brief. She's busy being a working mom to her 13-year-old son. My daughter, who occasionally talks to her mother, tells me Diana hasn't remarried and rarely dates. Apparently, her ex had to be dragged into jail before consistently paying child support. It sounds like a tough life without many luxuries, but we all make our choices and live with them. I won't apologize for moving forward with my life. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you soon.